Most people assume Uzzah was struck down because he touched the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred object no human hand was meant to handle. It's the obvious explanation, and it seems to fit the story. But what if the obvious isn't the best? What if God's response wasn't about the touch at all, but about the message that touch would send? Sometimes the most shocking events in Scripture aren't punishments for sin, but lessons about God's nature. Think about it. If Uzzah steadied the ark, the impression would be that God needed help to protect his own glory. That single act could have whispered to Israel and to their enemies that Yahweh was no different from powerless idols like Dagon, who couldn't even keep his own statue upright. The deeper question isn't, why did Uzzah die? But, what truth was God protecting? And once you see it, the story of Uzzah becomes less about human failure and more about divine sovereignty. If you've ever wondered why God would strike down a man who only meant to help, stay with me. The answer isn't as simple as it looks. And once you see it, the story of Uzzah will never read the same way again. In summary, I will demonstrate that God struck Uzzah down because his action conveyed the wrong message. But before I delve into that, let's establish the historical context surrounding Uzzah's story. Although Uzzah is only briefly mentioned in 2 Samuel 6, the background to this story is found in 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 6. I will briefly summarize those chapters next. They provide essential background information that helps explain the events leading to Uzzah's tragic fate. In 1 Samuel 4, we find a significant and somber event in Israel's history. The Israelites go to battle against the Philistines, but they suffer a devastating defeat. Seeking to turn the tide, they bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield, believing its presence will ensure victory. However, this plan backfires. Though initially frightened by the Ark, the Philistines again rallied and defeated the Israelites. The Ark is captured, and the two sons of the high priest Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas are killed in the battle. When Eli hears the news, especially that the Ark has been captured, he falls over, breaks his neck, and dies. This chapter marks a turning point, highlighting the consequences of Israel's spiritual decline and setting the stage for Yahweh's interaction with the enemies of Israel. In 1 Samuel 5, the Philistines, having captured the Ark of the Covenant, bring it to Ashdod and place it in the temple of their god Dagon. Overnight, the statue of Dagon falls face down before the Ark. They set it back up, but the next morning it's found fallen again, this time with its head and hands broken off. As a result, the people of Ashdod and surrounding areas are afflicted with tumors. Recognizing the power of the Ark, they decide to move it to the city of Gath. However, the same afflictions occur there, so they then send the Ark to Ekron. The people of Ekron, fearful of the disasters that the Ark seems to bring, cry out and demand its removal. In 1 Samuel 6, the Ark of the Covenant's journey continues as the Philistines, plagued by suffering, decide to return it to Israel. They consult their priests and diviners, who advise them to send the Ark back with a guilt offering of 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, representing the plagues that struck their 5 rulers and cities. The Philistines place the Ark and the gold items on a new cart, hitched to 2 cows that have never been yoked. Miraculously, the cows head straight for the Israelite town of Beth Shemesh without straying. The people of Beth Shemesh rejoice at the Ark's return and offer sacrifices to God. Unfortunately, some of the townspeople disrespect the Ark by looking inside it, and as a result, the Lord strikes down 70 of them. The survivors lament and send messengers to the nearby town of Kiriath Jearim, asking them to take the Ark. turn to the second book of Samuel, chapter 6. King David sets out to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark is initially transported on a new cart, but when the oxen stumble and Uzzah reaches out to steady it, God strikes him dead. This shocks David, and he temporarily leaves the Ark at the house of Obed-Edom. After seeing that Obed-Edom and his household are blessed because of the Ark, David decides to move it again, this time with great care. He has the Ark carried by Levites and offers sacrifices along the way. David himself dances with all his might before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod. We could elaborate on the meaning of these passages, but we will focus on the events that took place in the Temple of Dagon. Since Yahweh took advantage of the Ark's presence in the Temple of Dagon as a teaching moment, what lessons did each demonstration impart to the Philistines? In many polytheistic religions, idols are viewed as physical representations of deities. The idol of Dagon likely served as the central focus for the worship of this god, similar to how the Ark of the Covenant was the focal point for the worship of Yahweh. When the Ark was placed in the Temple of Dagon, it provided Yahweh with an opportunity to teach the Philistines that he is real, powerful, and present. Furthermore, Yahweh used visual examples to demonstrate that there was no living entity behind or associated with the Dagon idol.
Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. When the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who enter Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day.
According to cultural expectations, when an enemy lies face down on the ground at the feet of a king, it symbolizes complete submission and defeat. This action signifies the enemy's acknowledgement of the king's authority and supremacy. In the same way, when Dagon's statue was found face down on the ground at the feet of Yahweh, it represented Dagon's complete submission and defeat. It's important to understand that an idol is not the god itself. It merely represents the deity. While the idol serves as the focal point of worship, if the god were truly real, he should be able to manipulate his environment independently. For example, when the priests of Dagon lifted the statue to place it back on its pedestal, it raises an important question. If Dagon were real, he should have been able to lift the statue himself, especially if Yahweh allowed it. Instead, Yahweh permitted the priests of Dagon to handle the statue, which demonstrates that the idol is nothing more than a visual representation of an imaginary fictional character. After it was discovered that the idol lay prostrate before the ark, the people of Ashdod placed it back on its pedestal, never stopping to wonder why Dagon needed their help. Remember this point because it helps to explain what happened to Uzzah. The following day, the statue fell, leaving it without a head and hands. What does this signify? The pieces of Dagon's statue were scattered across the threshold, right in front of the temple door. Anyone entering would inevitably trip over these fragments, making them impossible to overlook. It was as if Yahweh physically held their heads to face reality, forcing the priests of Dagon to confront the evidence as they stumbled over the remnants. When considered together, The head and hands serve as powerful symbols of a living being actively engaged in purposeful and meaningful activity. The head represents thought, creativity, and intellect, while the hands signify work, action, skill, and accomplishment. The depiction of the idol with both its head and hands removed serves as a powerful metaphor for a lifeless entity that is devoid of thought and action. By choosing to illustrate the absence of these essential body parts, Yahweh not only emphasizes the complete lifelessness of the idol, but also conveys a profound critique of its inherent uselessness. The head, typically associated with intelligence and decision-making, and the hands, often symbolic of action and creation, are both missing, reinforcing the idea that the idol is incapable of any cognitive or physical function. This stark imagery underscores a significant theological assertion that worshiping such powerless figures is futile and unworthy of reverence. Through this imagery, Yahweh effectively calls into question the value of idolatry itself. As we trace the ark's journey from one location to another, Yahweh engaged with those who came into contact with it. Some individuals received blessings while the ark was with them, while others suffered from plagues. This served as a demonstration of his presence, showing that he was always with the ark, whether it was housed in a home or a temple. Yahweh also demonstrated his power among the people of Ashdod through pedagogical visual aids, showing that Dagon was merely a creation of the worshippers' imagination and did not truly exist. When Yahweh caused the idol to fall, and the people of Ashdod picked it up instead of the God doing so, it demonstrated that the idol was powerless. And when Yahweh made the idol fall and break apart, this further emphasized the idea that it had no inherent power to help the people of Ashdod. And when he caused a plague to break out, the people of Ashdod witnessed the impotency of Dagon. We now have a better understanding of the events surrounding Uzzah's fate, whereas we noted how God interacted with the people of Ashdod by using visual aids in the temple dedicated to Dagon. In Uzzah's case, God chooses to engage with David by using Uzzah as a visual aid. Now we turn our attention to the ark's return trip home.
Now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him to Baalah Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the very name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. They placed the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. So they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of fir wood, and with lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. But when they came to the threshing floor of Dagon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God.
Some people argue that Uzzah deserved to die because touching the ark was forbidden by law and showed a lack of reverence. If that is true, this begs the question: why was Uzzah alone punished? The Ark of the Covenant was typically transported with great care and reverence, following specific divine instructions. According to the Bible, the Ark was supposed to be carried by the Levites, specifically the Kohathites, using poles inserted through rings on its sides. The Bible does not explain why David chose to transport the Ark of the Covenant on a cart, nor does it clarify how the Ark was placed onto the cart. It is unclear whether the Ark was raised with poles and then lifted onto the cart, or if it was lifted by hand. In either case, the Ark was not being transported according to the law. Though David and his men were also guilty of disobedience and irreverence, yet God did not strike any of them down. This raises an important question. Why did God ignore David and his men while only reacting to Uzzah? One could argue that Uzzah was acting responsibly and with good intentions. The Ark of the Covenant is Israel's most valuable cultural artifact, and allowing it to be damaged due to carelessness can be considered a serious offense. By attempting to protect the Ark from harm, Uzzah demonstrated the respect and honor it deserved. It was not his fault that the Ark was being transported on a cart instead of being carried by wooden poles, as the law prescribes. If the Ark had fallen, King David would have been held accountable for negligence, as he was the one who decided how the Ark should be transported. But what if we have misinterpreted God's actions? We assume that God struck Uzzah down because he committed sacrilege, as if God reacted to Uzzah's touching the Ark. What if our assumption is incorrect? What if, instead, God was reacting to Uzzah's attempt to steady the Ark? I see a parallel between the fall of Dagon's statue and the potential fall of the Ark. Yahweh caused Dagon's statue to fall, demonstrating that Dagon was an imaginary god who could not prevent his own statue from toppling. If Uzzah, rather than Yahweh, had intervened to stop the Ark from falling, what would that imply? Could we conclude that, like Dagon, Yahweh was unable to keep his own Ark from falling? If Yahweh had permitted Uzzah to steady the Ark of the Covenant, it would convey a problematic message similar to the one he had already communicated to the Philistines regarding their god Dagon. That Dagon is not a genuine deity. The fall of Dagon's statue illustrated this point vividly. Just as the idol could not uphold itself, allowing Uzzah to support the Ark would imply that Yahweh, too, was not truly powerful. In this scenario, it would appear that the Almighty God required human assistance to maintain the integrity of his own Ark, which would undermine the perception of his divinity and might. Allowing Uzzah to intervene in this way could lead to the troubling conclusion that the supposed all-powerful God lacked the strength to prevent his sacred object from tumbling. This would detract from the reverence and fear associated with Yahweh, presenting an image of a deity who is vulnerable and dependent rather than sovereign and omnipotent. Ultimately, such an act would diminish the holiness of the Ark and detract from the message of divine authority that Yahweh wished to convey to his people and their adversaries alike. What occurs when an action conveys an unintended message? The consequences can vary significantly depending on the context in which the action takes place. In this particular situation, the act of steadying the Ark may unintentionally communicate a message that could be easily misinterpreted, leading to widespread confusion among observers. Such misunderstandings can have serious ramifications, potentially resulting in a loss of trust or faith in God, thereby harming his divine reputation. For instance, Uzzah was struck down for his actions because he inadvertently created the impression that God required human assistance to maintain the stability of the Ark. This suggests that God, in his omnipotence, was incapable of keeping his sacred Ark steady while it was being transported on the cart. Allowing such a misconception to persist would undermine the fundamental belief in God's sovereignty and power. Therefore, the severity of Uzzah's punishment illustrates the importance of ensuring that actions align with the intended message, especially when it comes to matters of faith and divine authority. Finally, in a profound demonstration of his power and authority, God chose to engage with David through the tragic incident involving Uzzah. By striking Uzzah dead, God created a powerful moment that undeniably captured David's full attention. This stark and shocking event served as a compelling visual aid, making the divine message not only more impactful, but also deeply memorable for David. The gravity of Uzzah's death forced David to confront critical aspects of God's nature and his commands, prompting a necessary reflection on reverence, obedience, and the seriousness of approaching the sacred with the right heart and attitude. Through this experience, David was compelled to focus on the essential truths about God that would shape his understanding and relationship with the divine. building a space for honest, grace-filled discovery. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe and click the bell to stay connected. Thanks for watching.